Good morning, everyone. Very brave out at this time of the morning. My name's Ken Smith. I am the new Dean of the Australia and New Zealand School of Government, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning. At the outset, could I recognise the traditional owners and custodians of the land and the elders, both past and present. It's a great honour to welcome you here today and to particularly welcome Professor Julian Le Grand. The background of today is that Melina Morrison from the Business Council of Co-operatives and Mutuals contacted both Helen Sullivan, the Dean of the Crawford School, and ourselves to try to get something together where we could share ideas from Julian's significant experience in terms of the broader public purpose sector. So I'd like to thank Melina and an old colleague, Julian McVie, who I haven't seen, I think, for 30 years or so.
Let's leave it at that.
We won't go back when we did work a long time ago. And could I also recognise here Pat Troy and also Bob Gooden, very distinguished academics who've made major contributions to thought and thought leadership in Australia. To Helen Sullivan from the Crawford School, to my own colleagues, Professor John Warner and Associate Professor Catherine Althouse. So welcome everyone. I think we've read about Julian's background, and I was just saying to Julian, I only got back to Australia from 6 years in London, working in Australia House, which is sandwiched between the London School of Economics and King's College. And I can remember an Australian Englishman has now taken the Vice-Chancellor President's role at King's College, and Ed Byrne and colleagues from LSE, including a lot of Australians who've moved to the UK and spent a lot of time there. Bronwyn Curtis, who's a very distinguished economist and media commentator who is involved with LSE, often got involved in discussions about the relationship between the two universities, LSE calling King's a tech college, and the competitor, and if you know that area of London, they're encroaching on each other, particularly as King's have now taken on the old BBC house and headquarters as part of their extended campus. Julian, as a professor of social policy at LSE, you would have seen his background. He brings this incredible experience, but I think at the core across health, social work, education, all of those areas is one big challenge that is occurring really in the broader public purpose sector. And that challenge is, how do we improve service delivery? How do we ensure contestability, productivity, improvements in service delivery, but also how those services actually relate properly to their communities. We struggle still with subsidiarity in Australia. We struggle in such a large continent with the ability of our governments, and it's not only federal governments but also our state governments, to absolutely deal with the issue of place and how place should be a major factor in the way that services are delivered. So Julian, welcome. Your experience is amazing across both government and the mutual and cooperative sector, and we look forward to the discussion with you this morning. So please welcome Julian.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Chair. It's a great privilege to be able to speak to you today and to come to Canberra. I always enjoy my trips here. I was originally here and following the Gillian McPhee lead. I won't tell you how many years ago, but a substantial number, for 3 months and staying in Canberra. I had a wonderful time, a very productive time. It was courtesy of Pat Troy and Bob Goodin that I was here. And ever since then, I've had several repeat visits, and every time I've enjoyed it. This time, though, is different, because this time you have successfully managed to lay on Australian sunshine. And I'm so pleased about that. On previous occasions, I have to say, I thought I must be something of a rain god. Every time I came, the rain seemed to follow me from London. You have failed in one key respect, though, that you did not manage to lay on an English victory in the test, and I'm quite upset about until the last day. What I want to talk about is what I think is really is quite a new and exciting development that's going on throughout the Western world, and the Eastern world as well, actually. Which is the development of what we call the hybrid economy. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, and then I'm going to move from the general to the particular and talk about one particular aspect of the hybrid economy, which I've been involved with quite extensively here in the UK, which is the public service mutual. So, let's start with the hybrid economy. Prepare for action. What is a hybrid? Well, essentially it's an organisation that has got more than one bottom line. It's not only concerned with profit, as, say, the conventional corporation might be, or maximising shareholder value. It's not only concerned with social welfare or social well-being, as a government organisation, at least in theory, might be concerned with. It's not even like an NGO with concern for a particular client group or a particular area of problems. It's basically got 2 or 3 explicitly stated objectives, which generally take the form of profit, social impact and environmental impact. Now, can I get rid of that? That's bit there. Let's see what I can do. Okay. We're seeing hybrid organisations. They're not. They come under a variety of names. There's the Toyota Prius, of course, which I've just bought one, and I think is wonderful, incidentally, a future reference. But I'm not thinking about cars, but social enterprises, public benefit corporations, rather big in the States, the development of public benefit corporations, where they've actually changed the corporate law so as to allow corporations in various states, I think something like 23 states now, to allow corporations not only to maximise shareholder value, but also to have these additional objectives. Many corporates even operated still under the old law, but they now have large corporate social responsibility divisions. In the FTSE 100 of the top 100 companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, every one of them has a corporate social responsibility division. And of particular interest to this particular lecture, the many cooperatives and mutuals, including especially public service mutuals. It's worth noting that hybridity, ugly word, hybridity is spreading. You can see it with, there are certain financial instruments with hybrid elements. Impact investing is now very popular, where investors want to not only make a financial return, but also have a social or environmental impact, positive, and social impact bonds, which many countries are now experimenting with, including, there are several, I understand, in Australia. Even the World Economic Forum, Davos, as always, is getting in on the act. They call it they talk about the fourth sector as distinct from the private sector, the public sector, and the NGO sector. Now, this fourth sector, the hybrid economy. I did do some research to find out how much hybridity is going on in Australia. There's not a great deal of numbers I was able to track down, but I estimated 20,000 social enterprises. Most of them are small businesses, but there are one or two large ones. Interestingly, they're growing. 34% of them have been established in the last 2 to 5 years. The industry, they tend to be in the service sector. We might come back to that, actually. There's a reason why they're in the services sector. But a large proportion in healthcare. And the aim is to basically, some of them are focused specifically on employment opportunities for specific groups, and some of them are particularly on causes, social, economic, and environmental. And they tend, of the ones that are looking at employment opportunities and so on, they tend to be for disabilities, young people and women. This, of course, says nothing about the cooperative sector in Australia, which is enormous. Melina Morrison has been giving me the figures, but it's of the order of 8 out of 10 Australians are members of a cooperative of one kind or another, which are banks, credit unions, motoring organisations,
Health insurers,
non-profit health insurers, and so on. So they are cooperatives of a particular kind, what we would call the user-led cooperative, rather than the employee-led cooperative, which is the kind I shall be talking about later on. But nonetheless, an indication, again, of the spread of the cooperative ideal within Australia. In the UK, we have a distinction between social enterprises. Those are hybrids that invest the majority of their profits within social environmental mission, and socially oriented business, which are still hybrids, but they don't necessarily invest their profit surpluses in directly furthering the social mission. They might have a residual profit that they distribute to members of in one form or another. Probably around 417,000 social enterprises, about 9% of businesses. If you add in those socially oriented business, then it goes to 1.7 million, which is about over 30% of all enterprises. So it's large, and it's growing. And that, of course, does not include large corporations with social responsibility divisions. We are seeing a growth, I think it's very interesting actually, a growth in corporate social responsibility. Don't know if this actually qualifies as a socially responsible organisation. Why are we not going? They have as their second bottom line after profit, the bottom line, don't be evil. Actually, they've changed that. Does anybody know what it now is? They got such stick for don't be evil. It's roughly that. It's do the right thing. The right thing. From a sort of negative to a positive element. I don't know how many of you come across this particular advertisement. Patagonia they provide outdoor clothing of various kinds, and they marketed their latest jacket using this particular advertisement. And the message of the advertisement was, they incidentally are very environmentally conscious, and they explicitly state that their aim is to actually to improve, to have a net positive effect on the environment, not just simply a negative, avoiding a negative impact. The message of this advertisement was, you should not buy new jackets because it's environmentally unsound. You make do with the old one, you should repair and make the other one. Of course, it was an extremely successful marketing campaign, and they made something like 3 times their profits in the year after they'd marketed it. Unilever are quite an interesting one. They've got a very committed chief executive to corporate social responsibility, and particularly towards the environment. They've got quite an elaborate methodology for looking at the impact on the environment they have. I mean, in a sense they should have, because their products are not the most environmentally friendly of products. But they do take it very seriously. And are really quite admirable, actually, in many of the things they do. Its corporate social responsibility is spreading. In India, as some of you may know, it's actually compulsory. Any firm that that employs more than 500 people would have to devote 2% of its profits to corporate socially responsible projects. And actually, somewhat to the surprise of many cynics, it's actually working quite well. They seem to spend a lot on healthcare and on education. They spend on the local communities. Of course, one of the troubles is that Indian healthcare is terrible. Particularly, it's mostly private. So there's very little public healthcare, and in a sense, the firms are filling a gap that one could argue the government should be filling. China looks as though it's going down the route possibly of compulsory social responsibility. There is one slight perverse consequence of the Indian law. The firms that were not spending 2%, were spending less than 2%, have gone up to the 2% level. But the firms that were spending more than 2% have gone down to the 2% level in terms of their spending. So it doesn't always have the desired consequences. But China's also experimenting, and we believe that Saudi Arabia, following the Islamic tradition of zakat, where you're supposed to give 10% of your income to alms to the poor, that there are some developments there, but we haven't quite been able to track those down yet. But clearly, just part of the general spread of hybridity we're seeing in the corporate world. And it just may be, that this actually reflects a more fundamental shift that's going on in society and in society's values, and particularly among millennials. I apologise to any millennials who are in the audience, apparently, well, I'm told that millennials often don't like being called millennials. So anyway, I'm afraid I will stick with it for the moment. But it's quite interesting when you look at the motivation of millennials and the motivations of the rest of us. I was trying to think of a good name for the rest of us. And Centennials, I thought, and then it's like 20th Centennials. Anyway, you'll see that actually the motivations are quite similar. This is a study in the UK where people were asked to rate. They gave a rating scale showing the extent to which they are. These things were important to them. Financial for both groups, not as high, falling quite well below the others in terms of aims. Meaningful work very high, relevant to the mutual argument. Personal development, interestingly enough, though, is rather important, more important perhaps for millennials than for centennials. But interestingly too, let's get to the next one. Millennials did seem to have a much stronger commitment to the hybrid notion. How important is it for you that the organisation you work for pursues more than just financial goals than both are quite committed to that. It's worth noting. The rating is high, but significantly higher for the under 30s than the over 30s. Now, you obviously have to be careful with surveys like this. People say what they think the interviewer wants to hear. This may just reflect the cynicism of age. It may be that the millennials are young, the rest of us are old, and as usual, the old are more indeed cynical than the young. But it may we're trying to do a little more work to find out if there's something going on under this. It might be a little more than just simply the effect of age. Most of us grew up and certainly had intellectual forming under the period of, the period of the 1980s, which was the period of sort of state collapse, when with the government was discredited as a form of economic organization, most spectacularly in the Soviet Union, of course, and the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, but also the notion of nationalized industries in the West, with the dramatic sell-offs of utilities, airlines, and so on, all the way through. And then we went through a period in the 90s of kind of market ascendancy, when many of our intellectual ideas and values were formed. 2000s, of course, have seen a growth in skepticism of the market, particularly following the 2008. And I think that has been part of the driver towards this hybridity, this shift towards an interest in hybridity, trying to take the elements of both state and market, the good elements of both state and market, put them together, and to see if they would, to see if you can work out an organization that incents us both. It is both efficient, productive, and has a positive social impact and positive environmental impact, without having the sort of the stigma, not exactly stigma, without the moral glow of just simply being good enough to do good. It ain't easy to run a hybrid organisation. You are trying to merge two or three different aims, and you're trying to achieve them simultaneously. And there may well be substantial tensions between those aims. If you think about it, you've got, if you're trying to maximize profits or maximize shareholder value, that's easy. Or rather, it's certainly easy to state an objective, and it's easy to assess the decisions you make as an organization. Do they contribute to maximizing shareholder value, or do they not? Even within there are tensions about long-run profit versus short-run profit. But basically, you're dealing with with objectives that are in some sense commensurate with one another. When you're talking about environmental impact, and you're trying to compare that with profits and any trade-offs that might exist with making profit, not nearly so easy. You're talking about different things that are not incommensurate with another. In fact, environmental impact actually is marginally easier than social impact. I mean, social impact becomes vaguer and vaguer. What do we mean by social impact? What are we looking at? Poverty? Are we looking at employment opportunities for discriminating against groups? What sort of things are we considering? And when we have decided that, what are we measuring? Environment is easier to measure. I was mentioning earlier that Unilever are doing quite a good job of looking at the impact, but social impact. So it's tricky. We are also trying to explore how hybrids, in some sense, resolve these tensions, how they deal with it. One way to resolve it is to deny it exists. This is quite interesting. This is actually Australian. This is Australian data from Phases. I can't quite remember what Phases stand for, but it's a research.
Finding Australia's social enterprise sector.
Finding Australian social enterprise sector. It's by Social Traders organisation, and they've looked at at what people think in the social enterprise sector about this tension between them. And you'll see that a large proportion, in fact, it's almost exact, if you add up the strongly disagree and the disagree area, that's almost exactly the same as the amount that agree and strongly agree. In other words, they are completely divided as to whether there is a tension between the money and the mission or not. Most of the evidence we've been able to acquire suggests that there is. we've looked at, if you looked at the return on venture capital funds that have an ethical drive versus the return on venture capital funds that do have no ethical objective, there's a difference of about 7 percentage points. This is US data. Difference about 7 percentage points in the rate of return. It's quite interesting, actually. I'm quite surprised that venture capital, on average, over a period of about 10, 15 years, running over the 2008 period, but they get an average return of about 11%, which is extraordinarily high, it seems to me. But the ethical funds only get a return of about 3 or 4%, suggesting that on average, there usually is some sort of tension between the money and the mission. And indeed, if you ask social entrepreneurs, this is a study of millennial social entrepreneurs. This is across a very wide range of countries. A deeply irritating survey, actually, because they don't tell you very much about how it was done. And also they only give selected information about selected countries. I wanted to find the UK and Australia, and I couldn't find those. But they do say, I mean, interestingly enough, that 69% say social good, an important part of what they do, and 61% say have sacrificed profit to remain true to their values. Much higher proportion in South Africa and in the US and in Singapore than the average. So there clearly is a tension, and I think it's a very interesting question for academic researchers as well as the hybrid organizations themselves, is to start developing decision rules and ways of trying to deal with that tension and how you run an organization, a hybrid organization. Okay, that having said, let me talk about one particular form of hybrid organization that I'm particularly interested in, which is the public service mutual. Now, this came about because when I was privileged enough to work in 10 Downing Street for Tony Blair for a couple of years. That used to be a mark of distinction. I think the reputation is reasserting itself, but I didn't support the Iraq invasion rapidly. But although I was there when it was going on, but one of the I was looking at a number of areas. I was thinking about this problem, which the chair alluded to right at the beginning, the problem about how do we raise productivity in our public services. We had all our public services were creaking at the seams. The health service was a dreadful way, the education system was in a bad way, social work particularly, and that's what I was looking at, was bad. Social work, declining profession, morale was declining in a bad way. Social workers complaining about burnout and a massive turnover of staff and so on. I remember talking to one group of social workers, to a group of children in care, and one of them was she was about 16, 17. She was going on to get married quite soon, too early in my judgment, but that was her decision. She said, well, in the past year I've had 5 social workers. I didn't even meet 3 of them. They changed before they could get to see me. And who am I going to invite to my wedding? He said, and I thought it was a very telling comment on the system. Well, that she would like to invite a social worker to a wedding. I think that's an interesting point. But that she felt really upset that she did not have any kind of sufficient personal relationship to be able to do this. Now, at the time, I had also been looking at GPs. Now, GPs in the UK are organised as as professional partnerships. It's smallish groups of GPs who work together. They own their own premises and they contract with the government on a capitation payment basis. The patients enroll, well, every family in some sense enrolls with the local GP. It's not a fee-for-service system, which I think you have here. You have more of a fee-for-service system, don't you, with the GP. It's a capitation system. Anyway, you have these GPs operating as professional partnerships, and frankly, very successfully. I mean, it's of course they have their problems and they moan a lot, but on the whole, I think it's generally thought to be a rather successful system. Of course, it's also rather well paid, but it's good in terms of morale, in terms of status, in terms of the feeling of control that the professional has over his or her working life and his or her environment. And I thought, well, why not try and replicate something like this with social workers? Maybe what we could do is have 6 to 8 social workers who spin out of the public sector, spin out of the government, and form a professional partnership themselves. Maybe they might even own their own premises. They might own their own business in a sense, and then they contract back with the government to provide the service concerned. I put this to the key people in government, and they got quite excited by the idea, and I eventually chaired a working party, and we to take it forward, and we recommended establishing a number of pilots to try this idea. And indeed, we did, and we set up the pilots, and some of them have been quite successful. 1 or 2 were not, but I can tell you about that trajectory at a later point. But and I remember visiting one of them a few months after they'd been set up. No, it was about 2 years after they'd been set up, and the children were actually. The children were all in the building, and they had a drop-in centre for the children in care. They'd sent up in the building, and they were making a video in praise of their social worker. It was almost unbelievable that in the UK context, I imagine that children in care would actually praise their social worker. And then I was talking to one of the people working there. And I mentioned this case of the girl who said, "Who would I invite to my wedding?" And she said, "Oh, I've been invited to 6 of my children's weddings." So it almost brought tears to my eyes. It was like everything one would hope that the unleashing of commitment that this setting up of a mutual had unleashed. Was manifest in the way they worked and the way they operated. Quite a lot of them turned out to be, they did a lot of babysitting for the foster families, babysitting of the children that they were social work who were being fostered. It was just at every point they seemed to take, they went the extra mile, they worked the extra hour just to deliver the service, and they seemed to have such a nice personal relationship with the children concerned. It was, as I say, everything one hoped would occur. The Blair left office, Gordon Brown briefly held office, and then a new government came in, a Conservative government, a coalition government, Conservative with Liberal Democrat. I didn't know, wasn't sure what their attitude towards mutuals might be, or towards these sort of ideas, but it turned out that there was one particular minister, Francis Maude, who was a great enthusiast, and he asked me to chair something called the Mutuals Task Force to try and spread the idea throughout the public sector, we succeeded. We've gone from about 9 mutuals now to about 100. I'd like to say it was because of the Mutuals Task Force. We're now delivering about £6 billion worth of public services. But actually it was also, and this is rather important, it was also, or mostly I think, because the government also set up a mutual support programme. A relatively small amount of money, 10 million pounds, and doled it out in very small amounts of money, but they doled it out to people who wanted to set up a mutual, public sector employees who wanted to set up a mutual, and needed advice on the legal form. What legal form should one have? Whether it should be whether it should take a form of a charity, a corporation, a sort of corporate structure, or whatever. Financial, business. Most of them had never done any business planning. Most of them didn't know any elementary accounting. So all those to give those little bits of advice, and it was very. They found it immensely useful. So let's be a little more precise. What is a public service mutual? Mutuals are organisations that are owned and run by their members. Now the members, I've been talking about employee-led mutuals. They are employees, but as we've indicated, in the Australian context you have a lot, they could be user-led. They could be both employees and users, and maybe also the community. You have some mutuals where you have community representatives on the board as well as employees, and sometimes, in very rare cases, you've even got some shareholders on the board. In each case, just to make this point, the crucial element of a mutual is that they have a right to control. They have a measure of control over the decisions made by the organisation, and they have a right to the residual. That is to say, if the mutual makes a profit or a surplus of some kind, they have a right to an element of that residual. And we tend to use the term public service mutual to describe the group of public sector employees who've spun out of the public sector to form an employee-owned mutual to deliver a public service. To be frank, we've tended to always talk about spinning out of the public sector, but it could also include a group of people who will come from quite different areas. They might be working in an NGO. They might be working in the private sector or whatever, and they want to set up a mutual to form an employee-owned mutual to deliver a public service. And I think it would be perfectly legitimate to call those also a public service mutual. We've tended to focus on these public sector employees who spun out of the public sector. Just 3 examples of public sector mutuals. This is called Central Surrey Health, or they just rebranded themselves, I think, as CSH. This is a group, started off about 600, about 10 years ago, 600 nurses, community nurses and therapists, and they spun out of the public sector. It's been very successful. They're now about 1,800. They've got a number of contracts with different governments, and they provide community hospitals, they provide community nursing, physiotherapy services, and so on. To show that they're not all in the health social care area, this is a habitat mutual. They specialise in in preserving woodland habitats. They manage about 13 of them. Much smaller, they're about 10 to 15 employees. And this is an interesting one. This is the My CSP, which is My Civil Service Pension. They are a back office organisation. They administer the civil service pension in the UK, which is enormous, of course, enormous sums of money, enormous numbers of people involved. Interesting enough, they are what we call a multiple stakeholder mutual. That's to say, one that not only they have about, I don't remember the exact figures, but they have a proportion of employees on the board, a proportion of government owns a stake in them still, and a proportion of private shareholders on the board. None of them with a majority. So those are the kind of examples of the kind of things that we've got going. Now, why do we think they're a good thing? What is going on? I've sort of made vague references so far, sort of unleashing creativity and so on. Do we have any hard data on whether they do actually raise productivity in public services? The answer is we've got a lot of anecdotal data at the moment. There aren't really enough of them to produce any serious systematic research across the board to see whether they really are delivering in this way. However, there is quite a lot of evidence looking at mutuals that aren't necessarily public service mutuals, but are employee-led organisations across both within the UK and across the world. A classic example of an employee-led organisation, a mutual in the retail sector in the UK, is the John Lewis department store, which some of you may have heard. They regularly run top of the consumer satisfaction survey, deliver very high quality service, very, very, very widely praised. When you look at across other countries, in the United States, quite a few employee-led mutuals of this kind. There are others in Spain, and Bob Good and I were talking about Mondragon, some of you may well know something about, in northern Spain. In northern Italy, there are mutuals. France has quite a few too, of public, not of public service mutuals, of mutuals operating in the private sector. And it is extraordinary when you look at the research, and this is decent research, this is properly done studies really trying to control for different kinds of variables, but it comes out every time that they come out with higher productivity, lower turnover, lower staff turnover, less sickness absence, and greater customer satisfaction. Quite significant numbers, significant both statistically in the sense of statistical significance, but also significant in terms of the magnitude, the size of the differences involved. And interesting enough, they do seem to be more resilient to economic downturn. We thought that they might be more vulnerable in a sense to economic downturn. Don't quite know why that is. I think it's probably because the workers are prepared to take a pay cut in a way that in a normal employee, in a normal corporate or a normal large firm, they would not be prepared to accept it. But they're prepared to keep the organisation going. They are prepared to pool the distress and work consistently in adverse circumstances. What about public service mutuals? Why do we think that they are a good thing? As I say, not a great deal of hard evidence as yet, but we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence. But there are all sorts of reasons that have a certain common sense authenticity, but also I think we would argue are well founded in elementary psychological and economic theory to justify the argument. One reason why they appear to deliver such a good service is that they tend to have a flatter hierarchy. In a sense, that's obvious. The local authorities have an endless layer of management, particularly in the social work arena. I remember once, and all the decisions get leached higher up the management chain. I remember talking to one social worker in a large local authority, I think in Manchester, and she said that one of her kids came to her to ask for money to go to take a taxi to come back from a party, and in order to give her that money, the social worker had to talk to her manager. The manager then had to talk to the manager above him, it was a him in this case, to get authority, and even that layer had to talk to a higher level. And of course, by the time the decision came down, the decision was favourable, it could give the money, the party was long gone. It was months later, effectively. So you do get these hierarchical problems, and you get a much flatter hierarchy in those mutual. I'm sorry. More reliance upon frontline staff. Now, of course, you don't necessarily have to have a mutual in order to get either of these things. However, it does appear to be characteristic with mutuals and not characteristic of non-mutuals, and it generally contributes to better decisions and often more creative ones. Peer pressure, of course, mutuals are not perfect. Of course, you get people who want a free ride or whatever. However, you can have one of the advantages of mutuals is to give the opportunity for peer pressure to prevent free riding. And there's a double incentive, there's a double payoff to exerting peer pressure, which is that you get a better distribution of work, a fairer distribution of work, but also it contributes to the residual new benefit from the extra work that's involved and new benefit from any extra profits or residual that are generated. And this, I suppose, and I shall finish on this, is perhaps the most fundamental reason, which I think concerns the motivation of the people who work in public service mutuals. And it appeals to, as I've said there, to both the knight and the knave. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at public services, when you look at the policies, or when policymakers look at public services and they want to, when they think about the policies to try and improve those public services, they usually have implicit, when they consider about the appropriate policy, they have in their minds some theory of human motivation, some view of human motivation. Now, they won't necessarily state it, and they may not be conscious of it. And really there are two extreme views of human motivation they could have. One is illustrated by the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, who wrote this, which was arguing that when thinking about any system of government, and he would have included, we had a public sector in health and education and so on in those days, he would have included that. You have to assume that every man, I'm afraid they only had men in the 18th century, every man ought to be supposed to be a knave and to have no other end in his actions than by private interest. And by this interest we have to govern him, and by means of it, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to the public good. Now, to be fair to Hume, he in the next sentence or two, he withdraws back from this statement. However, it is a view that is very widely held, not just by 18th century Scottish philosophers, but by many contemporary, often conservative politicians. That basically mankind is evil. This is mankind, not necessarily womankind. But mankind is evil, that fundamentally self-interested. It's not necessarily a moral condemnation. It's not necessarily that's a bad thing. In a sense, of course, it's perfectly legitimate for everybody to be self-interested. We're all interested in our livelihoods and the well-being of ourselves or our families and so on. It's just a fact of life that people are fundamentally self-interested, and you have to work on that presumption and organise your society, your economy on that basis. You might contrast this with that of my predecessor in the chair that until recently I held at the LSE, the Richard TIPNIS chair. Richard TIPNIS, some of you may well have heard of him or come across him. He was the last person to get a chair at the LSE, professorship at the LSE, without even having an undergraduate degree. And he was something of a saint. he was a very difficult man, actually. Saints are difficult. I don't know how many of you live with saints or know about them, but they do tend to be. They have a kind of, as I say, they tend to they squat on the moral high ground, and you try to scramble up to the moral high ground, and they kick sand in your face as you're getting there. He argued he had a very different view of the world, which was essentially that there was a sociological and a biological need for altruism, that we were fundamentally, no people were not fundamentally self-interested, they were fundamentally altruistic, and they had a strong desire to help. Now, if you believe that, then you design a very different public policy from the one if you believe the other. If you believe this, you tend to operate in what I would call the kind of the trust model of public policy. You basically say to doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, you believe they're intrinsically motivated to help people. All you've got to do is just give them the money, give them the resources, and let them get on with it. And that will deliver you the highest quality service. If you're a let me call him a Humeite, as I say, that's slightly unfair because he himself did not necessarily subscribe to this. But if you believe that basically everyone's a knave, then you're more oriented towards market type solutions, because markets, as we know from other 18th century philosophers and economists, Adam Smith, who argued that relying upon people's self-interest, the market was a good way of corralling that self-interest to serve the public good at the end of the day. So you're more driven, if you've got that philosophy, you're more driven down a market orientation. Here you're driven much more down a kind of a state orientation, an orientation where which you basically trust the public sector workers to provide. Now, of course, and this was Richard Titmus's quote where he talked about it. There was a great book called The Gift Relationship. If any of you haven't read it, it is worth looking at, The Gift Relationship, concerning blood donation and the wider implications of that, of markets for the welfare state. So, what's this got to do with public service mutuals? Well, I think it's worth noting that as I'm sure that all of you have in your heads anyway, both TIPNIS and Hume, or the Hume view, were wrong. It is clear that nobody is exclusively a knave, and nobody is exclusively a knight. We are all actually a mixture of knavish and knightly motivations. We're a mixture of self-interest and altruism. It is when they do surveys, and people who work in the public sector, and particularly professionals, do have probably a higher proportion, as one might expect, of altruistic motivation, knightly motivation, than do people who work in particularly the banking sector. They've been not altogether surprising, perhaps. Although I have a son-in-law who works in the private sector, works in a bank, and he's a true knight, I must say. But it's clear that actually, of course, human beings are much more complex than either of these two kind of caricatures would indicate. So the trick is really to recognize that complexity of motivation and to organize your human services system, organize your public services so as to appeal to both the knight and the knave, to make sure that you don't set up systems that drive out intrinsic motivation to do good, or on the other extreme, systems that ignore the fact that people do have their own interests to pursue. They are concerned about the well-being of their families, and they do want to get home at a reasonable time and not work every hour of the day. They do want to earn a reasonable income and so on. So people do have, so you must take both of these factors into account. Now, I think the nice thing about the public service mutual is there will still be some tensions between knightly and knavish activities within them. But on the whole, they avoid the problem of both problems. They appeal to both the knight and the knave. Most other forms of organisation have, and forgive me for using a certain amount of economics jargon here, but have principal-agent problems. This is principal-agent problems within the organisation itself. When we think of principal-agent problems, we normally often think of an agent being contracted by government to undertake certain activities in this context. But here I'm thinking about within the organisation themselves. If you take a large corporate that's delivering human services, you will have a set of employees on the front line who are a complex of motivations of the kind we've talked about. You will have privately paid doctors, nurses, teachers, and so on. And there will be a strong element of self-interest in their motivation, but there will also generally be a strong element of wanting to do good. They want to do, teachers in private schools want to do well by their pupils. The employees of private organisations, the doctors, will want to do well by their patients, and so on. The snag is that the agent, the principal in control of the organisation, the shareholder, only has basically one motivation. That's to maximise shareholder value, the value for shareholders. Now, of course, there are ethical shareholders, but on the whole, most of the investors in large corporates would actually have a single motivation. And that creates a real problem, particularly for the knight operating on the front line of a service being provided by a private sector corporation. They are torn. If they work hard, if they put in that extra mile, if they put in that extra hour, they will that could be exploited by the shareholder to basically, or the senior management, to create greater shareholder value. In large public sector organisations, there's also something of a principal agent problem. Again, the front line is often suspicious of the motivations of the people further up the chain. They think the politicians are out to maximise votes. They think the politicians are sort of venal and corrupt. I have to say, one of the great experiences about working in government was to discover that politicians were not venal and corrupt. That I actually I did find a group of decent people, on the whole, decent people trying to do an extraordinarily difficult job. But nonetheless, the perception often within these large public sector organisations is that the politicians can't be trusted, and indeed or indeed some of the senior managers can't be trusted. That they are bureaucrats trying to fight their turf wars, trying to expand their empires, trying to maximise their budget. Even it has to be said, you quite see this too in large NGO organisations too. You can often see a substantial degree of distrust between the frontline operators and the senior management about what's going on. And incidentally, you might just bear that in mind. In each of those cases, I was referring to large. Size, I think, matters. I think size matters in these contexts. One of the things about the public service mutuals we've been talking about is, on the whole, they are relatively small, and I think that does contribute a great deal to their success. But so we have, in a sense, almost a reverse principal agent problem in all these large organisations, whether in the public sector, the private sector, or even in the NGO sector. And that's what's rather nice about what appeals to me about the public service mutual, where you've actually got there is no principal agent problem because the agents are the principals. Essentially, the employees are the people in charge. So their motivations are running through the people running the organisation as well as the people delivering the service, because they are. The people delivering the service are the people who are running the organisation. So you don't now. That still doesn't mean to say that, of course, there will on occasion be tensions. On occasions there will be occasions where they will have to make a decision which will have a knavish a knavish outcome, benefit their self-interest, and that might damage the service they're providing in some way or another. Of course, those tensions will still occur. However, this fundamental tension and motivation between the principal and agent is withdrawn. And that is one of the major sort of theoretical reasons as to why I think this tends to work. So, I am an academic, so there's some reading for everybody to do. There'll be a small examination on it at a little later stage. But anyway, for those of you who are interested, I don't know, I think we can probably put these, I'm very happy these slides to go up on a website somewhere, so if people want to follow up, these are actually the references in the lecture, and then I've got some references on public service mutuals themselves, including some of the evidence that we've got about how well they're doing. So I think, Chair, on that note, I will stop, and I'm very open to questions or whatever. Right. Okay.
Thank you. The Chair's delegated it to me.
Oh, right.
My name is John Motter. I'm the Sir John Bunting Chair of Public Administration and one of the professors in the ANZSOG network, so thank you. I believe I'm supposed to be chairing for questions from the audience, so would anybody, maybe if you identify yourself as well, with your questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Robin Newbury from Director of Health Services, which is a for-purpose, not-for-profit organisation. I'm just wondering how they compare to not-for-profits in terms of cost and also in terms of the perception of government in the advantages or disadvantages of going down a mutual public service or mutual model as opposed to a for-purpose.
Well, we don't really have any hard evidence as yet, as I say, on performance compared with NGOs' performance for public service mutuals. I think there is a distrust of NGOs building up in government, the UK government, partly because we've had one or two rather spectacular failures. I don't know, has anybody here heard of Kids Company? Possibly not. Anyway, a rather spectacular failure, and it is thought, rightly or wrongly, this is, I'm just talking about perception here rather than necessarily reality. But the perception is that many NGOs are more concerned to do good than to do good well. That doing good is in a sense enough, and that they are not really putting in place the appropriate safeguards, the appropriate efficiency, forms of action, forms of activity, efficiency behaviours, and so on. And unfortunately, that has been reinforced by the fact that we have had several rather spectacular failures of NGOs that are delivering a public service are then outraged when they are told that they've got to shape up and they've got to be more efficient and more effective.
So does that mean that the government can better keep tabs on the quality of service in a mutual than they can in an NGO?
No, I don't think it does mean that. And one of the interesting things about these whole areas is that, of course, keeping tabs on quality is very difficult for government, whoever's providing the service. Yes, that's right. No, it's more a question of trust. Can the government trust the NGO? Can the government trust the private corporation? And can the government trust the mutual? And as I say, there are reasons for believe that the mutual will be somewhat more trustworthy to be both efficient as well as doing good. And incidentally, it relates back to a point you made earlier about the on the other side of the coin about privatization. And I think again one of the drives behind public service mutuals has been a growing disillusion with not only with NGOs, or not just with NGOs, but with the large private corporates. There's just been too many, again, it's a little hard because some of the private corporates have done a good job in many of the services they've offered. And there's no real, again, it's not really hard evidence of the kind that a social scientist would approve of. But there have just been too many scandals recently of the corporates apparently exploiting the asymmetry of information, the fact that they know what goods constitute quality and the government finds it difficult to know what they're doing. And so I think part of it has been a move, oddly enough, away from the kind of at least the conventional privatisation drive. If I could also, though, pick up on the privatisation issue, because this comes up, of course, time and time again, and this fuels particularly union objections to mutuals, and the unions, in our experience, are quite schizophrenic on this whole cooperative issue. I think this stems from the fact that they, of course, are, in a sense, unions are a product of two rather different traditions. There's the Marxist tradition, which views labour and capital as irreconcilable opposites, and is locked in, particularly in a capitalist environment, locked in a permanent battle. And in some sense, for labour to take over capital, which is what you could say a mutual is doing, labour taking over capital is almost a betrayal, in some senses, of what's going on. And then, of course, there's the cooperative tradition, very powerful. Sorry?
The guild socialist tradition as well.
Oh, the guild socialist tradition. Yes, indeed, yes. Which drives you in a very different direction. And we've also found that it rather depends on your position in the union. The junior union officials are often very supportive of the idea of mutuals. Very supportive. And you can see why. I mean, in many cases, they are actually the people delivering the service anyway, and they're going to be part of the mutual. It's the senior officials at unions who are most opposed to it. And if I can just, one other point in that context, though, I think to some extent, though, the unions do have a point that there is a danger, and it did happen with one or two of the early co-operatives in the UK. In the UK, there's some number of manufacturing cooperatives were set up in the 1970s, and they either went bust or they were taken over. And it does seem to me there is a danger of takeover in many mutuals. And what you need to do is you do need to build in some sort of governance structure that makes it impossible to have a takeover. Nobody could take over the John Lewis organisation. No corporate could take it over. The structure is just too. It's been designed in a way that you can't do that. They are now developing in the UK, and I think you're getting them here too. You're developing them in Australia. Forms of what you might call community interest companies that actually have an asset lock. The assets cannot be bought up by private organisations. That if the organisation is sold on, it is sold on to another public service organisation. That provides the assets accordingly. And there are a variety of devices for stopping privatisation in that form. So I do think one does have to bear that in mind when moving towards these mutuals.
So I think I'm interested in, I guess, Peter's austerity comment, but when I speak to government about mutuals and social enterprise, I see them coming from a point of view that they will be able to spend less in the future. And I was interested in understanding, these things seem to be more successful when you have strong government backing. And how did you get the strong government backing from a different type of government? And in my view, the benefits aren't necessarily about spending less. And in my analysis, you definitely don't spend less up front. But maybe what you can do is make the organisation less reliant on the grant and more focused on the impact and the profit at the end of the day. So interested in your views on how we can sell that argument.
Well, certainly the accusation is indeed, you mentioned that this is just another device for cutting back public spending. It's widespread. You do get this a lot. Certainly, every time that we talk about public service mutuals and we, in a sense, proselytise for them, we do try and make the point, no, this is not a device for cutting back, that they will not cost less. Indeed, on one or two occasions, particularly if you've got strong government backing with a government support programme, they may cost a little more, not a lot more. As I say, the support programme is pretty small. And I'm seeing, I think I'm supposed to be seeing your treasurer fairly soon, and I shall make the point that it didn't cost a lot more. No, the point is you're getting, but we do use the language of higher productivity, and what we imply by that is that there's a better service provided for the same resources. It's not a device for cutting back resources, it's a device for getting a more effective service, a service that the users value more higher out of the same resources. And that's a very, very important message that we would like to try and get across in this area.
Hi, my name is Kirsty Watson from the Department of Health, Commonwealth. You mentioned the John Lewis example a couple of times. I'm just interested to know how that model works in more detail.
Well, they have both a right to control and a right to residual. It's a very complicated structure, and I won't explain it to you now, partly because I don't fully understand it myself. So, but basically, they elect representatives of the 70,000. They elect representatives to a layer of decision making. They in turn elect representatives to a higher level of decision maker, and the election process goes on up to the top. And then they receive a bonus from the profits of the organisation. Every year they receive, which they like a lot. In fact, they are generally much more interested, sadly, they're much more interested in the bonus than they are in exercising the right to control. But that sort of pattern is broadly what you see in public service mutuals. You don't see people owning sort of great blocks of shares or whatever that they could sell on to somebody else. Partly for this very reason, you don't want to take. People will have one share, a pound share, and that will in turn, going along with that pound share, will give them the right to some surplus and a right to control.
Andrew had his hand up at the back, and then.
First of all, Julian, Andrew Podger from.
Oh, hello. Hi. Yes.
I apologise for coming in late. I'm interested in institutional structures more generally, and this need for accountability as well as performance. So the first question was, what's the nature of the contract with this mutual? How does that work if it's delivering public services? There's been a lot in the literature recently about public service motivation and what sorts of structures might best exploit that motivation if it's real. And the question then is, well, why couldn't you, through government institutional frameworks, exploit that motivation without actually setting up an independent organisation? Are there other forms of structures? We've used statutory authorities and things of that sort, but just wondered why this one, and is there something else within government might also deliver aspects of this?
Yes, it's a good question. I think in theory there is no reason why you couldn't have a government structure that allowed for the expression of knightly motivations as effectively as a public service mutual might allow for that. But it doesn't seem to happen. You seem to get there's something about, and this would apply actually to private sector organisations too. Something about the size of them that means almost inevitably you start leaching powers away from the front line and up higher up the... it also means, and certainly in the case of the private corporation, large private corporation, the fact that you've got a knavish motivation at the top means that they tend to use knavish drivers to encourage performance lower down. So you get pay for performance schemes, for example, self-interest. They use self-interested incentives right the way down through the system, which in turn has knock-on consequences for intrinsic motivation, for the motivation. But it just doesn't... I think the simplest answer to your question is that I just don't know why we don't seem to be able to replicate it in the context of large governmental organisations, these drive public sector motivation, or at least certainly not on a kind of consistent basis. Of course you will find some, I mean there was a social work department in Glasgow, I remember, that was a very effective and efficient, with very high morale social workers. But it did operate very much like a public service mutual. Essentially, basically what happened was that all power was devolved to the front line. They had small groups of frontline social workers, and there was not this leaching up of decision making upwards. The first point you made was about contracts. I can't remember.
What's the nature of the contract?
Oh, the contract. I think one of the things we've learned over the years of contracting out is that it is impossible to write a complete contract. I mean, of course, a lot of people said that's right at the beginning, but I think it has been, and that is, of course, has permitted some of these large corporates to exploit the gaps in the contract. So I suppose the answer is the contracts tend to be much more trust-based contracts, unspecified, incomplete contracts, basically. And the reason is because there's just a greater degree of trust in the organisation.
I'm very sorry, but I think we have to wind up. Next person to talk. So, one more question.
Oh, thank you. Leanne Anderson, I'm from the Commonwealth Department of Health, and in a previous life I used to deliver allied health services face to face. I was interested in your comment on the public mutuals that were set up in the UK around the service delivery of health and social services model, and the expansion from 10 to around 100. I'm just wondering how the success of that was actually measured, and was that actually dependent on where those services were, whether in a large town or a large city? I'm conscious of the NDIS rollout, the National Disability Services rollout in Australia, and a lot of the service delivery dependence at the moment is on where those services are and how people can access them. So the mutual model is quite interesting.
Yes. The example I gave, yes, it was Surrey, which is a sort of, I don't know, a suburb of London, effectively. So quite densely populated. And so you were able to provide, and there are quite a lot of competitors for that service too. So that is an issue. Incidentally, we haven't talked about the problem of monopoly, but that, maybe we don't have time to do that. But I'm very glad you mentioned the NDIS, because it does seem to me that is a bit of a golden opportunity. I mean, I would not be advocating, and I don't suppose Australians would want to listen to me if I did, a radical transformation of the whole service tomorrow. I think the NDIS gives a real opportunity, though, to run some pilots. You could develop some pilots and see if they deliver all the goodies that I'm promising that they do. Have a proper evaluation. Maybe you could even invite academics out to come and evaluate them. I'm not pitching for a job, but and I might be thought biased anyway. But I do think that the NDIS is very interesting. You would probably have to have them in your pilots in service areas. In urban areas, I suspect. I don't think it's not really. There is a problem. There's a problem with any monopoly, whether it's employee-led or not. I was interviewed once by French television about the idea of mutuals in the UK, and at the end of it all they said, we would never hand over our services to our employees. They'd screw us into the ground. And they were thinking of handing it over to a monopoly, essentially, a monopoly provider. And there clearly are dangers there.
I'm sure we could go on for quite a long time, but it's my pleasure to introduce Lena Morrison, who's the CEO of the Business Council of Co-operatives and Mutuals. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for handling that very interesting Q&A. I hate to see people's questions going begging. So the art of the vote of thanks is brevity. I'll try. First of all, thank you to the Crawford School of Public Policy and the Australian and New Zealand School of Government for the opportunity to partner on this very interesting lecture today. We had the pleasure of collaborating. This is the Business Council of Co-operatives and Mutuals that I lead in Australia, the peak body for member-owned organisations. We collaborated last year on the ANZSOG publication, The Third Sector Solution, and we really welcome that opportunity and look forward to many more opportunities to collaborate. And I think we've heard some great ideas about the potential to do that, particularly around the evaluation of these public service measures. I just personally like to thank the colleagues here, Peter Davis, John Butcher, Ken, and many others who brought this together today. We really welcome the opportunity. And I'd like to, most importantly, thank Professor Le Grand, who's provided us a very stimulating case for this phenomenon of hybridity. I've had the pleasure of trailing around behind Julia this week in various lectures. Hearing a new joke every time. It shows great vigour, but I've been thinking about hybridity and thinking, there's something in this hybridity that reminded me of something. And I remembered my grandparents being great gardeners were always planting vigorous hybrids. And so I really think there's something in here about hybridity that's about strength and diversity. Hybrid dogs are more vigorous than pure breeds, etc., etc. It's almost an ecological, an ecosystem thought that diversity strengthens systems. And that's certainly something that I think we can all think about in terms of public service delivery. So in the lecture today, or in the presentation, Julian has showed us that this is spreading, this idea, and for one example is the corporate social responsibility. It's now a central tenet of competitive advantage. And in our sector, the sector I represent, which is cooperatives and mutuals, CSR is part of the DNA of the business, if you like. It's the dual purpose is in the structure of the actual legal enterprise itself. So we talk about shared value rather than shareholder value, and see that as a competitive benefit. And finally, Julian illustrated that there's a huge opportunity here to partner with government, perhaps, to stimulate innovation with the example of your mutual support program in the United Kingdom, which incredible growth for such small investment, relatively speaking, of the 9 to 100 or so public service mutuals, £6 billion worth of services. So this is just an appeal back to the colleagues here at the ANU that we'll certainly vigorously argue for pilots and evaluation programs to look at hybridity in public service delivery in our meetings going forward, and I really look forward to that opportunity. Please join me in thanking Professor Le Grand.